So if you're like new to Northway, maybe this is your first time here, that video might have been like a little intense, right? Maybe even a little confusing, like what was all that about? So a couple things, if you're new, like if this is your first time, can I just say this right off the bat, welcome. So glad that you are here. I'm truly honored that you decide to come to Northway. And hear me, regardless of where you're at in your faith, maybe you're no faith, trying to figure it out, know this is a really safe place for you to sort of to decide, to dig into what it might mean to be a follower of Jesus. And please hear me on this, like we want to help. At all 6 of our locations, if there's something that we can do to come alongside you, please let us know. So that video, right? Like what was that about? Well, this summer, what we decided to do, we chose to study the book of 1 Samuel together. And we're lensing it as a summer mini-series, right? Sort of like on Netflix, you know, a mini-series, you'd maybe dig into it. And in June, we're doing the first part. It's a first series. It's 4 episodes, and it's been titled The Last Judge. And today, we are in episode 4, and we will conclude this first series. We're going to take 2 weeks, 2-week break, and then we'll come back with part 2. And it has 5 episodes, and it's titled The Tale of Two Kings. So that video that you just watched, it basically gave you a snapshot of all 9 episodes. Think of them as sort of like 9 movie posters. We know that during the summer, a lot of times people are traveling, they're in and out. So I want to encourage, if you miss a sermon, if you miss an episode, go to our website. You can check out, listen to it, or you can watch it there. So before I dig into episode 4, let me take a moment and sort of set the scene or reset the scene. Where is the book of 1 Samuel? What's going on in the history when these stories take place? Well, here you go. Moses, he's led God's people out of Egypt. And then Joshua has led them into the land that God has promised them. And while they are in this land, they are led by judges, charismatic leaders that God has raised up to lead the Israelites. You can find these stories in the book of Judges. These amazing stories about people like Gideon and Deborah and Samson. Well, Samuel is the last judge. And what he does is he anoints Israel's very first king, a man named Saul. And the book of 1 Samuel is sort of the hinge. It ends the period of the judges and it moves us into the period of the kings, from Saul and then eventually on to King David. So far in this series, we've looked at Samuel's birth and the commitment that his mother, Hannah, made. She made a commitment to raise him to know the Lord, to give him to the service at the temple, and she kept that commitment. We talked about in week 1 how important it is to keep our commitments in order so that we can have healthy relationships. In week 2, we saw Samuel create a monument to remember the powerful ways that God had protected the nation. And we discussed, folks, how important it is for us to remember those monument moments in our lives and the important relationships in our lives, right? And then last week, we saw that Israel decided they wanted to be just like all the other nations around them. Israel said, we want a king, just like everybody else around us has a king. And though both God and Samuel were against it, Samuel then went on and he anointed the first king of Israel. And last week we challenged everybody, right, that fitting in, that simply just trying to be like everybody else in the culture is no way to go through life. That if you're a follower, that means that God has set you apart and he's created you uniquely. And that should be visible in our friendships, in our marriages, in the way that we live life. And I said in week 1, I'll just sort of say it again here, that this series is never intended to just simply be a historical and factual account of the book of 1 Samuel. Each of these episodes highlights what we think is one key relational principle for our lives. So at the end of the series, we'll have 9 principles that I believe if we apply them to the key relationships in our lives, that by the end of the summer, we're going to have better relationships with our kids. We're going to have better marriages. We're going to be deeply connected to God. So that brings us today to chapter 12 of the book of 1 Samuel. Saul is king now. And I got to tell you, so far, so good. However, Samuel, in chapter 12, sensing that his days were drawing to a close, he offers his farewell address to the leaders of Israel. That's what all of chapter 12 is. It's Samuel's farewell address to the leaders. And as we close this first series, we're going to close sort of most of the story of Samuel. Samuel, for the rest of the book, sort of goes a bit behind the scene. He acts as Saul's prophet, and then he also goes on to anoint the next king, the one that God's chosen, David. But the book sort of pivots here, and it turns its attention to Saul and to David. And that's where we're going to pick up in the next portion in this series that will begin in a couple weeks. But for today, I sort of want to unpack and look at this farewell speech and consider something that I just want to say like a big, bold statement. Like, I think this is crucial to the health of our relationships. But saying that, I think this is so hard to do. The topic I'm going to talk about today is so, I think, hard to do. See, Samuel, he seeks out the leaders of Israel because he needs to have a hard conversation with them. Let me just ask you a question. Have you ever needed to have a hard conversation with someone? And like, maybe like you know you're going to have the conversation the next day, and even that night you're just like dreading it. You're like, oh man, I don't want to have this conversation, right? Have you ever had to have a hard conversation? Okay, and I just ask you a question. Don't raise your hand. Don't tell the person beside you. Just for you. Is there a hard conversation that you need to have with someone today? Maybe it's a good friend that's making really poor choices. Maybe it's a hard conversation that you know you need to have with one of your children. Maybe it's a hard conversation that you need to have with your spouse. Maybe it's a subject that you know once you bring it up, it's not going to go over well. It's going to be hard. It's going to be emotional. Maybe the hard conversation involves you needing to go to someone and ask for forgiveness. Or maybe the hard conversation is you need to confront someone that's done something to you. And you need to seek out that apology that you feel like you need. Is there a hard conversation that you need to have with someone right now? And I think my bigger question to you today is this. Have you been avoiding that hard conversation? Why? Why do we avoid hard conversations? In 1 Samuel chapter 12, Samuel has to have a hard conversation. And this is how he starts it. He says, "Behold, I have obeyed your voice and all that you have said to me, and have made a king over you. And now behold, the king walks before you, and I am old and gray, and behold, my sons are with you. I have walked before you from my youth until this day. Here I am. Testify against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? Testify against me, and I'll restore it to you." And these leaders respond. They said, "You have not defrauded us, or oppressed us, or taken anything from any man's hand." And he said to them, "The Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day, that you have not found anything in my hand." And then the people say, they agree. They say, "Yes, he is the witness." Samuel needs to have a hard conversation with the leaders of Israel. And he opens this really difficult conversation by humbly asking them, "Have I done anything sinful to you? Have I done anything evil or malicious to you? Have I taken anything from you? As your leader, as your friend over these many years, have I ripped you off? Have I taken a bribe? Have I harmed you in any way? Because if I have, let me know, because I want to restore it to you." Basically, Samuel opens this hard conversation by saying, I'm human, I'm not perfect, and if I've done something wicked or nasty to you, I need to know. And then he lets them answer, and they say no. What makes a hard conversation a hard conversation? Like, what are the elements that come together to cause a conversation to be a hard conversation? One, it's when opinions vary, right? It's not a hard conversation if you're in agreement. Secondly, the stakes are very high. Hard conversation, folks, they're not about sports or paint colors or favorite restaurants, right? Hard conversations are when we say to someone, I think you're drinking too much. Hard conversations are when you have to get together with your spouse and say, our finances are really in bad shape. Or maybe even more difficult with your spouse when you have to say, our marriage is in trouble. See, hard conversations are when we say, your anger, it's frightening me. Hard conversations is when you have to go to someone and say, I did something terrible, and I need to tell you. The third thing is emotions are strong. Hard conversations are going to be emotional. People might get upset. There will be pain. Opinions vary, stakes are high, and emotions are strong, are the elements of a hard conversation. Samuel needed to have a hard conversation with the leaders of Israel. The opinions in the room varied. The stakes were very high, and he knew it was going to get emotional. So he opens it up by humbly saying, have I done anything? Have I sinned against you? Have I harmed you in any way? Please let me know. Let me ask you the question again. Is there somebody that you need to have a hard conversation with today? So he opens the conversation. He leans into it. And he says in verse 7, now therefore, stand still, that I may plead with you. And he proceeds to tell them why he needs to have this hard conversation. And he reminds them of what brought him to this place. And he states it very clearly. And he doesn't like exaggerate or belittle them, but he has the hard conversation. And in verse 12, he gets to the point. He says this, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, when the Lord your God was your king. And now behold, the king whom you have chosen, for whom you asked, behold, the Lord has set a king over you. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if you, both you and the king who reigns over you, will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. He basically is saying you wanted a king, and God gave you what you wanted. Obey God and obey your king, and hope that your king obeys God, and all will go well. But if you don't obey God, or your king does not obey God, it's not going to go well. And he concludes his sort of farewell speech with this: only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king. That was a hard conversation that he needed to have with those leaders. Opinions varied. The people, they wanted a king. And in Samuel's opinion and in God's opinion, God should be their king. But the people, they got their king. And at this point in the story, King Saul was winning a lot of battles. So the leaders sort of, in their mind, their opinion was sort of trending up. Hey, this is working out pretty good for us. The stakes were really high. Samuel knew that if Saul or the people turned from God, God was going to lift his hand of protection and they'd be swept away. And finally, the emotions were high. Why do I know the emotions were high? Because there was a war going on all around them. The people were stressed. They were passionate, though, about their new king. The emotions were high. Hear me on this. All relationships have critical moments, and almost all of those critical moments take place in hard conversations. All relationships have those moments where we need to make a decision. Are we going to have this hard conversation, or are we going to sweep it under the rug and pretend that the tension is not there? Am I going to be truthful and speak to the issue, or am I going to pretend it's just no big deal? Do I say what I am deeply struggling with, even though I know it might create some tension, maybe even cause him or her to get upset, or do I just swallow it and hold on to it and keep the peace? Folks, Samuel was not taking a popular stance. It would have been much easier for him to swallow this. Just sweep it under the rug and just hope that everything works out okay. You know, if you don't know this about me, for the first 15 plus years of my ministry career, I did student ministry. I worked with middle school and high school students and young adults. And I got to tell you, this happened at least a couple times I can think of, probably more, where I saw two kids grow up together in youth group together. They became great friends. They decided to go to the same college, and they decided to be roommates together. Like, they were so excited, you know, to enter into this new season of life with their best friend, you know? But then somewhere before the semester was even over, they couldn't stand each other. Like, they're asking, how in the world did we decide to room together? And one of them would be home for the weekend or home on break, and they'd ask if they could get together with me, and they'd tell me all about it. They'd be like, she's horrible. She's a slob. She's so emotional and stressed out and uptight all the time. I can't stand her. And then I would say to her, so you know, what did she say when you talked to her about this? Well, I didn't talk to her about it yet. You know, I'm just going to try to get through the semester, then I'm going to switch roommates, right? I think when we're younger, sometimes we have difficulty with the hard conversations. You know, I was a student ministry leader for a long time, and the way I watch kids avoid hard conversations, at times it could be pretty hysterical, right? I'd see a guy ask a girl to the prom. She says yes. He changes his mind before the weekend's over, and then he texts her to tell her rather than have the hard conversation with her, right? I can't tell you how many times I've seen two friends, good friends, they have some kind of big disagreement or argument, and this one goes and talks to these 10 people about that person, and this person goes and talks to these 10 people about that person, and some of these people even know each other, but they never go and talk to each other about what the situation is. You know, for years at the church I served before, we used to do these big middle school dances. They were fundraisers for us. We had picture this, 500, 600, 700 middle school kids coming out for a dance. And let me tell you, there was a lot of emotions in that room at these middle school dances, right? And I can tell you, every single middle school dance I ever chaperoned or was at some point in the night, there'd be this pack of girls, and they'd be creating a defensive force field around their fallen comrade that was in the middle, right? And this gal that was in the middle, her boyfriend, the love of her life, that she'd been dating for 11 days. His friend just came over and told her he doesn't like you anymore, right? And then her buddies would gather around her. There'd be this force-filled blob of girls, mascara running down their faces, and they'd make their way over to the bathroom for a debriefing and retaliation session, right? Middle schoolers, they're not real good at having hard conversations. I could go on and on about the silly stuff, right? But I could also talk about the heartbreakers. A brother and sister coming to me, having found their single mom drunk on the couch night after night and not have any clue about how to have a conversation with her about it. A teenage boy who heard his mom in a sexual conversation with somebody from her work and not knowing how or who to address it. A young girl whose boyfriend is pressuring her to have sex, and she doesn't want to, but she doesn't want to lose him. She doesn't know how to have the conversation. A girl that is struggling with her sexual identity can't even begin to figure out how to have that hard conversation with her parents. A boy that just doesn't want to play football anymore, but knows how disappointed his father will be. I remember being asked to come with a young man who's knew he was going to disappoint his parents because he didn't want to go to college. He wanted to join the army. And he just knew they were going to flip out. And he had no idea how to initiate the conversation. I've seen teens struggle with hard conversations. But you know what? I really don't think we get much better at it as adults. Because I think at times we talk to multiple friends about the person that we need to go and have the hard conversation with, right? I've seen us use email or text for hard conversations, and those are really inappropriate platforms to have hard conversations. I think we sweep it under the rug and hope it'll just fix itself. I think we tend to back away because we're afraid that having the hard conversation, saying what you honestly feel is only maybe going to make things worse. So we become masters as adults at avoiding hard conversations. If you've had a hard conversation, sure, it might get emotional, right? It could be painful. It might cause a lot of tension. It might result in needing several more hard conversations about the same topic, or bringing another voice in to help you, or maybe even seeking counseling to process through it. But I'm going to say something, this is probably the most important statement I'll make in this sermon. If you don't have the hard conversation, your relationship will slowly die. I've seen it too many times with kids and parents, with marriages. I've watched great friendships die or become shadows of what they once were because hard conversations were not had. See, and I believe a lot of us, we think we're better at this than we are. Because what we do is, like, in our minds, we process through exactly what we're going to say. But then when we get into the hard conversation, what comes out is different. And when the tensions rise, right, we either withdraw or we start name calling or yelling. When it happens enough times poorly, we decide maybe it's just better to keep quiet, to keep the peace, to check out. And when we decide to do that, the relationship is going backwards and it's beginning to die. So I'm going to ask this a third time. Is there a hard conversation that you need to have with someone today? What are you going to do? Can I give you just 4 thoughts, maybe on how to approach this? One is this: you've got a choice to make. Take action or avoid it. You've got to make that choice up. Samuel took action. He waited for the right time and the right place, and he initiated a hard conversation face to face. He didn't send somebody else in there to do his talking. Secondly is this: he humbly asked if he had harmed or sinned in any way them, right? I don't know who it is that you need to have a hard conversation with, but don't go in like with guns blazing, right? With this litany of reasons why they're such a jerk face, right? Ask them. Start the conversation off. Have I hurt you in any way? Have I failed you in any way? Is there a blind spot that I'm missing? I need to know, I need to hear. And folks, man, this is really important. Please hear me on this. The hard conversation that you're about to have, it might come as a shock to them. In fact, you should assume that it will. See, for Samuel, in this moment, when he started laying in to these Israelite leaders, these guys were probably like, wait, like what? I thought you were coming to maybe tell us that we ended up being right. Like the king and this stuff's going pretty well. I thought maybe you were coming to apologize. They were probably floored. when he leaned in to them. See, often the person that we're going to have the harder conversation with will be shocked or minimally surprised. So that's why you need to anticipate that they're going to be defensive. Just anticipate that right up front. When you go to have this hard conversation, the person you're going to have with is probably going to get defensive. So here's what you need to do. Lead with respect. Say what you need to say the way that you would want them to say it back to you. Lead that way. There's a third thing. It's just 2 words: candor and kindness. In Zechariah chapter 8, verse 16, it says this: "These are the things that you shall do. Speak the truth to one another. Render in your gates judgments that are true and make for peace. Do not devise evil in your hearts against one another, and love no false oath. For these things I hate, declares the Lord." Verse is basically saying, speak the truth. Be candid. Don't pretend, but be kind. Don't have evil in your heart. Don't go into this hard conversation looking to give them a piece of your mind or looking for vengeance, right? Don't go in that way. Don't go in making oaths like it said in there. Don't say, if you don't do this, then I will never talk to you again. Don't start the conversations or enter into these hard conversations that way. Do it with candor, but kind. Ephesians 4 says, rather, speaking the truth in love. We are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. Hard conversations should always come out of love, not out of revenge. In John 13, Jesus says, by this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. He didn't say that you're going to know that you're my disciples because you're always right, or you always yell, or you always know it all. No, he says you're going to know that you're my followers because of your love, right? Jesus modeled this for us. He had hard conversations. He talked to Peter when Peter was out of line. The woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery gets thrown at his feet. And he says, go and sin no more. Right? It's candid, but it's kind. All throughout scriptures, all throughout the New Testament, Jesus, he has these hard conversations with the rich young ruler, constantly with the religious leaders. He's a master. He's somebody that we should model this after. The way he handles hard conversations, right? Please hear me, because the purpose of this sermon is not to get you fired up so you can go give somebody a piece of your mind. No. Love. Here's the last one. Stay at it. Work through it. Get help if necessary. Hard conversations sometimes are a series of conversations. I've seen too many good friendships end because people weren't willing to be honest. I've seen too many families alienated because they decide to keep silence. I've seen too many marriages die because hard conversations never happen. As go our relationships, as go our life, folks. Here's just a little side moment, maybe a bonus point for you in this sermon. Do you have Samuels in your life? Do you have people that you know they're willing to be candid with you and kind, but if something is off track and they need to have a hard conversation, they're willing to do it? Do you have those people around you? Folks, in the Old Testament, people were frequently in conflict with God. And in every single one of those situations, the people were wrong and God was right. But did God want to be right, or did he want to be in right relationship with us? I think the answer to that is found in the very first few verses of the New Testament of the Bible, because God breaks his silence and we hear the cry of a baby. And Jesus is born. And he came to be face to face and have the hard conversations with us. Do you want to be right, or do you want to be in right relationship? God decided he wanted to be in right relationship with us, and he challenges us to be in right relationship with our friends, with our family, with our neighbors, with the world. Frankly, that's where we're going to go over this next little 2-week series that we're doing, a little series called Right Next Door. And we're going to spend 2 weeks just sort of unpacking, love our neighbors as ourselves. What does that mean? And how in the world do we do that? Please come back next weekend, live teaching across all of our campuses as we dig in to that series. Who do you need to have a hard conversation with? Are you going to avoid it? I challenge you to start humbly. I challenge you to stick with it, wrestle it down to resolution. If we don't have the hard conversations, our relationships, the most important ones, will fade. And we don't want that, right? Let me pray for us. Father God, across all of our locations, help us have these hard conversations. God, give us the humility, give us the courage first to step into them. Help us keep our emotions in check. God, even right now, would you go ahead of us? And the person that we know we need to have that hard conversation with, will you begin to work on their heart? And that maybe this hard conversation won't be hard, it'll be beautiful. That's our prayer, Lord. We lift this up in your Son's name. Amen.